Okay, welcome. Last unit that we'll do lectures with. We will do Unit 8 Ecology, just kind of piecemeal. It's pretty easy, not bad. This one is natural selection and evolution. We're going to start by talking about a little bit about Darwin. I'm not going to talk too much about him. And then natural selection itself. So, I will admit that I will likely use these two terms interchangeably, but there is a slight difference between evolution and natural selection. Evolution is the gradual change of a species over time to better suit their environment, whereas natural selection is the process where individuals with favorable traits, good traits, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So natural selection is what drives evolution, but it is not necessarily evolution itself. It is the process by which evolution is brought about. So, talking about Darwin. I'm not going to get into his whole history. You have probably heard it before, and we don't really have time. It's not really on the test. But he was exploring the world, sailing the world, and documenting all the different species he found. Famously, probably most famously, were his finches that he found a bunch of different types of finch and eventually determined that they were derived from a finch common to the South American mainland. So this kind of is how he came up with his concept of species and natural selection. He coined a few terms in this. The first is adaptation, which is just any trait that makes you more fit for your environment. Then you have fitness, which is kind of like all of your adaptations gathered together. It's your overall ability to survive and reproduce. It's not necessarily like the most physically fit. It can be, but it is just how able are you to survive in your environment and reproduce. And then lastly, we have niche or niche. I prefer niche. And this is the role or function of the species in an ecosystem. So adaptations will likely guide the finches into particular niches. So like you can see in here, there's ground finches, there's tree finches, woodpecker finch, all sorts of kinds. They have different diets as well. And those are all examples of fitting into different niches, and they're all adapted to thrive within their specific niche. So expanding, the ground finch has a big, wide beak, and it basically uses it like a nutcracker to break seeds open and eat them. Then you have the cactus finch, which has a tough beak, but it also kind of works like pliers. It eats cactus parts and insects. And then you have the warbler finch with a smaller, narrower beak that is mainly eating insects. More like a pair of tweezers. So 3 different types. They're all very closely related, but they occupy different environmental niches. And they're able to do so because of their specific adaptations of their beaks. So, some key features of natural selection to know. 1, within a population, you will see variation in the inherited traits. Not everyone will actually inherit the adaptations, right? You won't ever see just one trait common to every single species. You see diversity. Additionally, every species can produce more offspring than the environment and the ecosystem can actually support. Most of the time, many of their offspring will fail to survive and reproduce, and so you generally have more kids than you can actually raise and have the resources to raise because you expect some of them to die. Next, if you inherit a trait with a higher that gives you a higher chance of surviving and reproducing, then you're going to tend to have more offspring than other individuals. Kind of on average, people with that trait will more often be able to survive and reproduce than things without that trait. This causes the favorable traits to accumulate in the population generation after generation, but it's important to note that individuals do not evolve. Individuals you're stuck with the genes you got. But when you have kids, you're able to pass down beneficial traits. But populations evolve, individuals do not evolve. And finally, natural selection does not create anything new. We're not talking about creating new traits. We are just talking about changing the frequencies of existing traits. So with the finches, the genes for those different beak types were all there. It's just how common are they within the population. But new traits are not coming from natural selection. Natural selection only works on what it has to work with, what you already have, which is why genetic variation is so important, because it is what natural selection can act on. So, some requirements. For natural selection to occur, you need a few things. There needs to be competition. There needs to be some people, some members of the species that will not survive and will not reproduce. It can be direct competition, actually like competing for mates, but it could also just be competing for food. It could also be, if you're a deer, for example, competing to hide from hunters. So it doesn't have to be a direct competition. Second, you need variation. You need traits, multiple different traits within a population. If everything in the population has white fur and there's no recessive alleles or anything, then it's very hard to change your fur color because you don't have any existing variation to work with. And then some of the variations need to give you an advantage over others. You have to be able to say this trait gives me more of an ability to either survive or to reproduce. It can't be something that doesn't affect that ability, which we'll talk about some specific examples in class. And then lastly, whatever the trait is has to be genetic and capable of being inherited. If a deer learns that it shouldn't go into a certain area of the forest every year because that's where hunters go, it's hard to pass that down. It might be able to teach its offspring, but in reality, that is not a trait that gets passed down. That's something that's learned. So it has to be something you can actually pass down genetically. And that is it. A quick one to start us off. We will do a follow-up with this in class. Sorry if I feel a little rushed. You hopefully won't mind. But that's all. See you later. Also, fun fact, Darwin ate most of the things that he observed as part of his observations was how they tasted. Wow, cool. See you later.